Hi, everyone. Looks like we're live. Welcome to JWA's book club, and welcome to our first video book club. We're thrilled to welcome Sarah Wildman, award-winning journalist and author of Paper Love, Searching for the Girl My Grandfather Left Behind. Sarah has reported for The New York Times, Slate, The New Yorker, and many other publications, and Paper Love is her first book. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So lots of readers wrote in with questions for you, but before we begin, can you give a short description of the book and talk a little bit about how you came to write it?
Sure. So Paper Love is the search for the lover my grandfather left behind when he fled Vienna. I found a note, a funny little folded note, in my early 20s, right after college. And in each quadrant of the note was a selfie, if you will, of a girl asking my grandfather why she wasn't being written to. Why wasn't he writing? And my great aunt wrote me and said, you should tell their story. The girl's name was Valerie Scheftel. She was a doctor. She had gone to the University of Vienna Medical School with my grandfather, and she'd fallen in love with him the minute she'd arrived on campus. And he'd ignored her, and then a couple of years later he fell in love too, raced to Czechoslovakia to tell her. They were supposed to escape Nazi Vienna together, and instead he chose to escape with his mother and sister, leaving her behind. And for a long time I thought there was nothing more to know than that, this sort of tantalizing yet kind of very open-ended detail of his life. And then a few years passed and I discovered a box labeled Patient Correspondence A through G, and in that box were hundreds and hundreds of letters from his entire exploded Viennese world and dozens from this girl. And I then decided to go in search of what had happened to her, and using her words to layer against the restrictions she was under, I go in search of archives and geographies and place, and I layer against also how the third generation, my generation, the grandchildren, both of victims and of perpetrators and bystanders, relate to this history now. So it's a kind of interweaving of history, memoir, and journalism, and so that's a kind of basic outline of the book.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to start with a question that I have.
Okay.
So I was kind of amazed as I read the book because it's such a Jewish women's archive kind of book. I mean, it really eventually becomes all about bringing this woman's story to light that really, if not for you, never would have seen the light of day, we can assume. This isn't,
Right.
a woman that we could learn about in any other way, and you really give Valley a voice. So I'm wondering why you felt that it was so important to write about this one particular woman, and why it's important to tell an individual woman's story among, the millions who had similar stories.
Well, I think that sort of both a personal and narcissistic as well as altruistic aim for this in some way, right? So to some degree, having grown up with Holocaust survivors and refugees all around me, I always wondered, who would I have been? And I wondered for a long time about what had happened to the Sarah Wildmans, if you will, people who'd gone to university, educated, but we don't own a Renoir, we're not being, talked about in the press. What happened to the regular person? And the idea of restoring the dignity of individuality to someone who is lost amidst the enormity of 6 million Jews and 17 million victims was something to me very, very powerful. And she is this kind of amazing, modern, feminist character, right? She cares more about her profession than marriage or children. She stays behind for her mother, but her mother, too, had raised her from the age of 1 alone. Her mother had divorced the year after she was born, never remarried, and raised her daughter alone and sent her to the best school in the world on her own. And she decides she can't leave her mother behind. That's part of it. And I think that she felt so palpably relatable, and it allowed me to understand better the period through the eyes of a Western woman for whom being Jewish was, of course, an essential piece of her life, but in a weird way it was like the color of the wall or the color of her wallpaper. It was not, the fabric of what dominated her day. What dominated her day was a sense of professionalism, intellectual pursuit, a man she falls in love with. She feels really modern to me, and in some ways, it was an accessible entry point to this history in a way that I had never had before, even though I knew so many survivors growing up. And then she gives this incredible gift of hearing her voice. And she has this literary, gorgeous writing style that was something for me, just this both opportunity and a responsibility. Here I had the text in some way, and could I read against the grain, as we used to say in feminist theory, and look at what she's not saying? Because she doesn't talk about the restrictions she's under, and she very obliquely references the way her life is getting more and more and more narrow as restrictions are placed upon Jews in places like Berlin. So she ends up going from Vienna to the town in Czechoslovakia she's from, and then on to Berlin. And in Berlin, life changes in increments of this sort of dismantling of normal life by piece by piece by piece, as she's writing and talking to my grandfather and telling him the things she can say because everything is censored.
Right. So on a related note, do you think that Valerie stayed in Europe out of obligation to her mother? And this is a question from Eliza, by the way. She wants to know what Valerie's choices say about the role of daughters during that time and how they connect with how we live today as women and as daughters.
It's a good question. At one point in the book, I talk about how, I'm struck that Valerie is working with children, but she doesn't talk about a desire for her own children, though she's approaching and passing 30, which of course then, even more than now, let's say, was an age where a lot of women already had children. But I say in the book that she's much more involved with her role as a daughter. Mm-hmm. And, more women remained behind in Berlin and in the heart of the Reich than men, in part because men were attacked first. Kristallnacht affected men more aggressively than it affected women, and there was a brief window of time where people felt that it was important to get husbands and brothers and fathers out because they were the ones being rounded up first and sent to Dachau, and that women wouldn't be attacked because who would attack women? I mean, sort of the cornerstone of society is women and children first, or whatever it was. Western life was predicated on the idea that women would be safe, which of course was not true. So in part, women sacrificed themselves and sent brothers and husbands and fathers out. And that in Valerie's case, that's actually not what happened. What happened in Valerie's case was that I think that she couldn't leave her mother after all her mother had sacrificed for her, first. Secondly, I think that she also did not have any kind of guarantee from my grandfather. She had no sense of exactly what their future looked like. And she says at some point that she wanted to ask him, she wanted to say, marry me, stay with me, be with me. I'm not even sure if it was marriage that she wanted. I think she wanted some sense of security that this relationship was the relationship of her life. And I think she's not clear on that. And that, I think, is relatable to all of us. I mean, I think that many women now go through these periods of time, like long, important relationships where it's just not clear where they're going. And I think in the relationship to daughters, I mean, I think all of us relate as children to parents differently. And in Valerie's case, I think that facing the apocalypse of the Jewish 20th century, or the 20th century Jewish apocalypse of, war Europe, I think that she felt a very strong sense that her mother had always been her rock and had always been this incredibly strong businesswoman, and that they would be better together than apart. And I think that they saw it as a bit as a team as much as anything else. And I don't think it's simply a case of caring for her mother. It's not a case of an ill parent. And in fact, her mother ends up with a higher ranking position within the Reichsvereinigung, the Jewish council, if you will. It's not really a Jewish council, but the Jewish organization that controlled Jewish life in Germany. So I think that it's a mix of all these things. I think it's dedication to her mother, and also a sense of, at some point they're very, very alone. They end up in a city where they know no one but each other, and this becomes her entire community for a time. And then that shifts. I mean, if you've read the book, you see that I end up discovering this entire world of the few young people who remained. So I think there's different pieces of that. But I think it's a bit different now. We're much more atomized. We're much more likely to live far from our parents. And I think we're much more likely to make decisions that aren't quite as connected. And at the same time, I think we would make these decisions if, for example, we had an ill parent that we needed to take care of, or, you know, there was some dire need. And she is facing a dire need. I mean, they're in mortal danger.
Right.
The woman knows that.
Thank you. So Karen asks, this journey took you years from start to finish. How did your ideas and perspectives change from when you started your research to when you finished writing the book? And did the process of writing itself change your mind about anything that you were covering?
Well,
that's a big question.
Yeah. Wow, I mean, there's so many different ways to go in that. Well, for one, I think that one of the big messages of the book is that, so early on, I discovered, I was the first journalist to accompany scholars from the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington to the last unopened Holocaust archives in Germany, in this town called Bad Arolsen, and the archives are called International Tracing Service. And at the International Tracing Service, I had hoped that they would hand me a file of some kind that showed me, you know, here I'd made this journey, but I wanted to find this file that said, here's what Valerie did, and here's what she did in 39, and 40, and 41, and 42, and 43. I wanted a kind of documenting that would be easy to find and all in one place. And I think in part, you know, I knew even then it would be naive to think that way, but I think in part our digital life and the way that we use Google and the way that we think about how accessible information is has allowed us in a weird way to think we have access to all this information and not have to look very hard. And I was constantly reminded of the benefits of digging into archives and asking questions differently and learning how to ask questions that I hadn't known to ask. And, you know, I kept thinking a lot of the time of this 8th grade science teacher I had who used to say, not knowing what you don't know is worse than not knowing. And a lot of the time I kept realizing that I wasn't asking the right questions because I didn't yet know what the answers were that I was looking for, if that makes any sense. So at the archives, I discovered that someone else had come looking for Vali before me in the 50s. And in and of itself, that someone else had come looking for me and that you could find that wasn't something that had occurred to me to look for either. I had only saw her within my very narrow focus of my grandfather, without thinking that she lived in a community, you know, that there might have been someone else who cared for her, which didn't make sense, for one. And then the process of going about looking for that person, you know, I had really kind of given up, you know, within a few digital searches, and I'd found a great deal of what this woman had requested from other archives, but I didn't do a kind of deep dive into finding her until I kind of relaxed my brain, let go of all my digital crutches, and decided to go back to how we searched before, right after the war and during the war, which was to place a classified ad and find someone in this kind of really old-fashioned way of looking. So it was a lot about letting go of of any kind of presumption I had, about letting go of any kind of preconceived ideas of what I was looking for, and trying to look at it from so many different angles. So that changed over time, and understanding what modernity gives us and what it's taken away. And I think in some ways it's taken away some of our kind of deeper research abilities sometimes, because we're so used to being able to find things quickly. And then, you know, and I think in the greater takeaway message is about the idea that, you know, my family had always had this sense of, you know, this escape with all the essentials, his sister and his mother and his nephew and his brother-in-law, and that's a child's idea of the world. I mean, it's a very narrow focus. It's the nuclear family. And in some ways this became both about the communities we live in now and the ways we're connected to each other in a transatlantic context between generations, and not thinking of this as a single, as much as this is about a single search and the dignity of individuality, recognizing that we're not atoms bouncing around the world alone, that we interact and that we're shaped by and we shape the people we come into contact with now and then. So all those things kind of play a role, and finding the family that was searching for her ends up opening up this entire other realm of understanding for me. And recognizing that I wasn't, you know, so grandiose as to be rescuing this person, that there were others that had had this idea before me.
Wow. Yeah, I have to say, one of the most remarkable parts of the book, I thought, was everything that took place in Bad Arolsen. It was that, I mean, that was the part that I found myself telling people about because I kind of couldn't believe it was real.
Yeah.
I had never heard of this place before, ever. And reading about it was really surreal. I mean, it is kind of hard to believe that that exists in this, like, captured in time sort of way that you described, like an Indiana Jones movie.
Yeah, it has a sense of the kind of end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark,
Right.
the Ark of the Covenant, and I mean, for me, the space, all of it is bizarre because the town itself is this Baroque city center with a prince named Wittekind of Waldeck. The godfather is Heinrich Himmler himself, and it's beautiful and bucolic and looks untouched, and then all around it are these SS barracks with miles and miles and miles, literally miles of material. And then you go slightly outside the center, and there's this old NATO driving school. And now it may have changed by now, but when I went, it was stacks and stacks and stacks of paper, and every single one of them were requests. Do you know what happened to my brother, my mother, my sister, my aunt, my husband, my wife, my grandparents? And all of these requests from people who were just desperate for reconnection in a time when there was just no way to find people. Nothing showed me the chaos of post-war Europe in a more palpable and concrete way than this. And I think that it was this sense, too, of the devastation and the extent of it. And, of course, as a Jew, I mean, we think so much about our own, but this really also highlights the devastation for Eastern Europeans who were forced laborers, and the kind of incredible refugee problem that Europe had, and the destruction of families, across all of East and West Europe.
Wow. So, moving on to the next question. Oh, I do want to say to everybody who's watching right now that if you didn't get a chance to submit your question in advance, you can submit them now through the comments section here, so feel free to write in if you have questions as we go also. Okay, so Rachel wants to know how much hope you really had to find Valley alive, or find that she, survived the war and lived out her life in a European city, and she wants to know if you ever really believed that that outcome was possible.
Well, without upending the book for people who haven't read it, because I do think the journey of the book is important, I did. I mean, I had, it was hard to say at the beginning. I think more than anything, I wanted to unravel this mystery. Remember, I started very late, though, so even finding any eyewitnesses at all I knew would be a long shot, I suppose, because, the fact was I was looking for 90-year-olds or 95-year-olds. And, part of this book is very much about this tipping point between memory and history. They were at the last moment of finding eyewitnesses. And, it was as much about wanting to see if I could create that context with eyewitnesses, or was it going to be entirely through archival work, through the letters that I'd found? I don't know that I knew exactly. I hear the question, and I think that it was a mix of things. It was a mix of a kind of perhaps naive hope to come across this woman who would be able to, sort of sit me down with some beautiful tea set, and we'd have a long chat about my grandfather. That was perhaps the most wildest fantasy, and yet I had to somewhat nurture it for a bit. And at the same time, honestly, a lot of the people that I was looking for, for example, there were these little tributary stories that come into the book, one of which is that I discovered these, very small piece, which is that I discovered these cousins in Bad Arolsen who had fled from the Lodz ghetto and survived and eventually end up in Australia. And I have this idea that I'm going to find them, and I get in touch with people who worked with them, and I say, oh, somebody says they do know them, and they get in touch with me, and they said, oh, I worked with her in the 60s, great. And he said, no, she's died long ago. They're not living now. And he puts me in touch with their child, who's, I guess, my parents' age. And so, to be honest, looking in general for this age bracket is quite difficult. And it's one of the things that exposes the fault lines of Holocaust studies, or thinking about this history going forward, which is how much do we need the kind of visceral, tactile relationship of meeting an eyewitness? I mean, how much do we rely on that emotional impact when we know we're losing them, you know? So I think it was all of those things, you know, this question of, was it possible to find this specific person, and is it possible to find any of them? So finding eyewitnesses in general was incredibly important because I really wanted that. And at the same time, I was very conscious throughout that this is among the last books where this will be possible.
Wow. So Leslie asks, near the end of the book, you write in reference to your daughters, quote, "Do these girls need these stories too? How do we impart history without the burden?" She wants to know how you would answer those questions. Do your daughters need these stories?
I guess that I think that they do. I mean, to some degree, I think that this book was as much a legacy project for them as it was a passion project for me. And I think this is the way I will introduce them to this material when they're older. I mean, not now. And I do think that they do. The question is, I'd prefer my kids not to have the nightmares I had growing up. You know, I used to have these nightmares of escape. You know, that I was about to escape and, you know, the Nazis were coming, but I was about to escape alone and not with my parents or my sister. And did I want to escape alone? What did it mean to be alone? So the embodiment of that terror is something that I would prefer not to pass on. I'm not sure that that's useful. But I do feel that they need to know the legacy that they inherit, that the choices that my grandfather made enabled their lives, you know, otherwise they wouldn't be here. And I think that that sense of import was in large part driven home by being pregnant through so much of this project. I mean, pregnant twice during this project, because I think that I was very conscious of the passing of generations and what did it mean to have this generational transition, I guess. And so, yes, I think I do. I mean, I ask that rhetorically, but I very much do think they need these stories. The question is how to do it without imparting a great amount of trauma and imparting this as a way of understanding this legacy. Because for them, you know, the war is going to feel like the Civil War feels to us, like, you know, something you study. It's sort of distant and dusty in some ways. So, and of course, to certain families, the Civil War is not dusty or distant. So how do you navigate those things? I don't know that I have the right answer, and my kids are really small, so I have a little bit of time. And I'm not really ready to talk to her about the Holocaust, the older one even. In fact, she picked up Lois Lowry's book, Number Our Stars, the other day when we were in a bookstore, and I bought it for her, but I said I'm saving it because I think she's only 6, the older one, and I think that it's too early. Her biggest introduction to the war has been The Sound of Music. So that's a little bit of an easier take on the whole thing.
Yeah. Interesting. So switching gears a little bit, Miriam says, another fascinating female character in the book is Sarah Wildman's grandmother. Can the author tell us more about her grandmother and how she felt about all of this? I'm assuming all of this meaning, you know, knowing about Valerie and the letters and kind of holding that inside of her.
So my grandmother was this incredibly strong woman, very sort of no-nonsense. She'd grown up with immigrant parents, one from Russia and one from Latvia. They ran a dry goods store, and she was very, very smart herself. And she went to Smith, and then they pulled her out after 1 year and sent her to the University of North Carolina at Greensboro because of money problems. It was the Depression. And she was actually very good with numbers. She ran like a small on the side. I mean, she was a homemaker ostensibly, but I realized actually after her death how extensive she had run this small real estate business. She had kind of bought up houses over time and apartments in their town and rented them out and had done quite well for herself with them. And she was sort of a non-sentimental person. But at the same time, I was constantly surprised by how modern she was. I mean, a story I told at her funeral, part of my eulogy, was that in my 20s, I think, I went to see the movie Antonia's Line with her. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's a Dutch film about a woman who comes back to her tiny Dutch town with a daughter after the war, and it's clearly a daughter born out of wedlock. And then the film is filled with all sorts of couplings, same-sex couplings, extramarital couplings. But it's integrated questioning around the idea of partnership and love and children, and it's a complicated film, but there's a ton of sex in it, and I was completely glad to be sitting next to my grandmother during it. And at the end of it, she turned to me and she said, "Wasn't that an amazing story about all the ways one can love?" And I thought, oh, I underestimated you. Love is complicated. It's not one thing. So I think that my grandmother had a couple of reasons to feel mixed at best about Vali as a character and as a part of my grandfather's past. In part, I think that that's because, my grandfather came from a place that she could never know, even though she went to Vienna with him a million times. The Vienna of my grandfather's childhood had ceased to exist. Those people weren't there. That Jewish Vienna was gone. And as much as he talked about it, and as much as his social circle was created by it, in some ways even post-war, it's not something she could ever see. And so Vali is this symbol in some ways of this past, as well as, I think that all of us know people in our partner's past that in some way might needle us, and yet, it depends on how sharp or how dull it is, where you are in your relationship at that time. So I think that these things were very complicated, and do I think that she necessarily wanted us to dig into this? I'm sure not. Or I'm not sure not. I would imagine not. But, I don't know that I don't know. I think that the comment on true love is something that happens in a marriage that's a very long marriage that goes over time, and I think there's certain lines one just throws at each other, especially about someone who's rendered holy by being kind of part of the past.
Interesting. So, similar to that, Vivian asks, how typical was it for women to become doctors in Vienna in the 30s? Is Vali an anomaly? I was interested to learn about a highly educated woman from that time. And I guess the same really applies for your grandmother. She was also a highly educated woman in the 1930s.
Yeah, so when I set out for this, I of course did think she was an anomaly. But in the interwar period, actually this became much more common, and there were quite a number of women at the University of Vienna studying medicine in particular. And in fact, of the Jewish population, which was quite large, women made up a large percentage, and I have those numbers, although they're not at my fingertips. There's been a lot of good scholarly work about after women were allowed into the ranks of doctors, they sort of flooded in. And so by 31 or so, when she enters school, it's actually not that strange to be coming to the University of Vienna Medical School. She was a part of, actually, I think, a second wave. The first wave was sort of the, gate crashers, and then she's part of the people who are a little bit more comfortable and feel that it's really their place to be there. That said, I think that it was still remarkable to come alone from Czechoslovakia, even though, remember, the part of Czechoslovakia she's from was very German-speaking, so they really looked to Vienna as the center of the world rather than Prague. And so I think it's remarkable to overcome kind of economic issues and to go alone and to have come from a single-parent household and to have those achievements. But she was not singular. And it was actually really interesting to me that there was this whole cadre of women who were very, very proud of their experiences and who wanted to be seen as doctors first. A lot of them went into, psychoanalysis, for example, with Freud being there. But there were a number of doctors, and I think lawyers, secondly. Excuse me. Yeah.
Well, so women studying as doctors was really a phenomenon. Like it wasn't, that women were at the same levels in all departments.
I think doctors were a phenomenon. In fact, I have the picture of his graduating group, which was in December of 37, and it's 3 rows of people. It's not a huge number. And the first row is almost entirely women. So let's say they made up not quite a third. I don't think that's quite as much, but between 15 and 20% of the class. But I don't want to say a number because I'm not sure exactly what the numbers were. But and I think, I feel like it's in my bookshelf, but there is an entire book, of course, about this. Actually, you know what? I'll find it here. I'll find it in my bibliography. But there is a number of work on this, and I actually was really struck by it, and I wanted very much to understand better about the number of women who came. Yeah, Harriet Pass Friedenreich, Freidenreich, and her book is called Female, Jewish, and Educated, The Lives of Central European University Women, and it came out from Indiana University Press in 2002. So, so she's done some really important scholarly work on it. That's actually an academic book, but it's interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Huh. So, let's see. We have a question from a viewer. Given what you found out about Vali and the despair she reveals in the letters at being forgotten and left behind, how do you feel about your grandfather now?
Well, I think that the letters and the points in the letters where he doesn't feel like he's responding fast enough and is he doing enough, those are very difficult. And, I kind of spent a lot of time wondering about it. What was he doing? What wasn't he answering? And I think in part because his life in America was quite difficult at first for him. It was hard for him to fully respond to her. Now, that's not an excuse, but I think that was part of it. But ultimately, the takeaway about my grandfather is that he lived with great joy and optimism and a sense of mindfulness that is connected very much to what we think about now when we talk about living in the moment and being very present. And knowing what I know about the despair he was witness to within her letters and in the post-war letters of his greater extended family, I actually think he's quite remarkable, even more remarkable in a way than the kind of heroic, bon vivant, kind of larger-than-life, charismatic character that I knew. The fact that he was able to be that person and live with that joy, despite the loss he'd experienced, and he was really quite powerless. Granted, he could have written more, but beyond that, he was quite powerless. So I think I think that's the takeaway in some ways, is how was he able to live with that optimism without the sense of neurotic angst that I would certainly carry, or at least I think I would, and live for the moment and for what he had, and to embrace what he had and sort of celebrate what he had without feeling that he didn't deserve it in some way as a result of what everybody else had gone through.
Right.
So I think that's the biggest takeaway about him.
Yeah, and I also thought it was really interesting how, in so many ways, especially in his letters, he comes across as, such an old world, Viennese gentleman, but really he made a remarkably American life. He struggled through setting up this medical practice and raised a big family here, and it's just his optimism. You really do an amazing job painting a portrait of him, but it is almost hard to believe, how positive it seems he was able to remain. But I guess, a big part of getting through trauma like that is finding, hope.
Right. No, I think that's right. I think you're right. It's a very American story, and it's a uniquely American opportunity. At the same time, I think his letters, especially to Bruno, expose that he was also often on the outside observing. Mm-hmm. And he's very conscious of the way in which he thinks Americans are not conscious of history, are not conscious of what people have gone through. They sort of list things. He has this one letter from 1977 of some UJA event where he says they list things, Tel Aviv, Mauthausen, he has this list, and you think it's interesting because 1977 is just before the Holocaust becomes much more a part of popular conversation and consciousness. Bizarrely, it sort of happens after 1979. So I think he's aware of what he carries more than those around him do, but he doesn't sort of enforce it or push it upon them. And at the same time, he really loved this country. He's a huge, huge fan of this country. A lot of those letters, which aren't in the book, talk a lot about his anxiety about the rise of communism and the Soviet Union, which of course was dominating the conversation in the 70s, the Cold War. So there's that.
So Rachel says, thank you so much for this book. How much was your search about finding out concrete answers, and how much of it was about the importance of your journey itself? And was the process of searching cathartic for you?
I think it's both. I think that my idea of answers became, over time, was replaced by the search, that the search itself was, the destination, not to sound like a, fortune cookie. But I think that there is, I think that the search was really important. And for me, that search, was as much about the sort of love affair with geography that it is, walking the spaces that she walked, seeing the ways in which the kind of archaeology of cities has allowed cities to kind of grow and move on and replace what was there before without real understanding of the trauma that took place in all of those spaces. It was the whole thing was important for me. I mean, yes, I was desperate for more answers, which is why I felt like I'd hit a wall before I'd find the searcher who had come before me at the International Tracing Service. I wanted to be able to give you everything about her, even though archivists said to me, there's no such thing. I mean, even we today who live with these kind of long digital files of ourselves, you can't find a single file that shows you what happened from birth through the full life of someone. And I wanted to paint her as much as I possibly could in her experience, and that meant finding, kind of concrete answers or facts. And then it really became about the journey as much as understanding everything that was going on around them, and about, kind of trying to understand why I'd felt outside of my own life, let's say, in the United States. Like, why did I feel more comfortable being on the road? Why did I like that so much? What was it connected to this history in some way or another? What's the legacy mean for me now? It goes back to this thing of, growing little Jews. But, being what is my identity? There were so many different pieces to it, and kind of investigating that all along the way.
Wow. So Sarah wants to know, since Paper Love was published, have people contacted you who knew Carl and Valerie or other characters you write about?
So there have been a handful of I've had a lot of really interesting letters. Recently, I was contacted by a rabbi in Israel named Rafi Jospe, and Alfred Jospe is a rabbi who writes to my grandfather in the spring of 1940 and tells him that the Jews of Stettin are about to be deported, or have been just deported, and that, can my grandfather get these $350 Chilean illegal visas for Valerie and her mother and save them. And he impresses upon him that they're in mortal danger, a full year before the final solution. And I then discovered that my grandfather is incredibly impoverished at this point, and he has no access to money. But Jospe's letter for me was really poignant and important, because it meant that he knew more than I realized people knew, especially by February of 40. And so his son, who's a rabbi and professor in Jerusalem, wrote to me and said, I heard that my father's in your book, and let me give you some context for what he had been doing. And he provided context that he had been hired to go and visit Jews all around the Reich before he flees himself, to find out how they were living, what they were doing, how they were surviving. And that was really, really interesting to know more about who this rabbi was. I had done some digging, but not a huge amount. A fair number of people have contacted me who knew my grandmother, some who knew my grandfather, some former patients of my grandfather's who knew him and liked my description of him, actually. One person told me that my grandmother was the best wife ever, So yes, there have been some. I think and then some of the characters of the book themselves have written to me since to talk to me about the book and the portrayal of various people in it. So that's been heartening as well, because it's anxiety-provoking writing about people whose narrative is all that they had, actually. They leave with almost nothing but their own story, and how do you do justice to their story?
Do you think that your family's perception of what you refer to in the book as the family myth has changed during the course of your research and your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, yes. I mean, for one, even Vienna itself is challenged because, I get into this whole thing about how Jewish men in particular, but Jewish students were under attack in 31 to 34, well before the Nazis come in, and that this idea of the kind of perfect city was already upended well before he flees. So there's that. And nobody knew anything about how impoverished he was. That material that I found at the Immigration Research Center archives at the University of Minnesota, that was something that nobody knew about. And I think even the post-war rancor that exists between my grandfather and his extended family, where there's all this kind of anger and fighting over, you don't know what happened to us. There's this niece that writes that says, that her parents are dead, her brother is dead, her husband's been deported, and she hasn't heard from him since. Her sister's husband has lost his mind, and she's angry she hasn't heard from him, but it's worse to be alone in the world. All of them only remember that Lotte and my grandfather were the closest of friends. And so this rancor and this sense of the recriminations that were tossed back and forth was something so suppressed that the second generation had no consciousness of it at all.
Wow. So that's unbelievable. We have a question from a viewer. This is from Lisa. She asks, how did your parents relate to this family history? You talk about the remove of generations. Is this uniquely a grandchild's quest? Could either of your parents have asked the same questions or wanted to pursue the story to the extent that you did?
So it's my father's father. I do think this is a grandchild's journey. My aunt hosted an event actually a week or two ago in Montclair, New Jersey, and she said similarly, the second generation felt very, in some ways, they observed a pact of, not silence exactly, but a pact of recognition that the narrative they'd been given was the narrative that they were going to remain with. And they didn't really push into that narrative, in some ways because it was too painful or bruised, in some ways because it just was the culture of the family to kind of accept the story that they'd been given. And this is true not just in my family, but a lot of second-generation children will tell me the same thing. I think for me, the remove of the generation has allowed me to not have to exactly respect the boundaries of his hero worship, I guess. I mean, it's not that they were so worshipful, but, to be allowed to say, gee, I know we grew up with this, but why? In a way that I think was easier for me because easier is not exactly the right word, but it was distant enough from me, especially because I lost my grandfather when I was 16. I was in my late teens or 16 turning 17, and so for me, he had already become a character in a strange way, and in that way, I was able to kind of, disrespect the narrative, I suppose, or at least challenge the narrative, if disrespect isn't the right word. I could challenge it and push past it and wonder about it in ways because I had already grown up with it being told to me secondhand by the time I was in my 20s. So I think there's that. My parents, my father and my aunt have both said that the book has made them both wonder why they didn't ask more questions. Why didn't they push when they could? So many of these people they knew, not just my grandfather, and so why didn't they ask more? And that's something that I think a lot of people say, post a death of a parent, and that doesn't have to do with being a part of a war generation or not a part of a war generation. I think that it's harder to ask while they're alive if they don't seem to want to talk.
Thank you. Eliana wants to know if you treated telling and uncovering a woman's story differently than you would have a man's, and if that changed for you during the course of your research at all.
Well, I think that I related more to Vali as a character, I suppose, than I would have if it was a man I was in search of, because she felt like me, someone who was, obsessed with her career, not sure about marriage and kids and things. Those are all sort of secondary to her. And so I think that she felt like someone I could know, and especially the way she spoke. And that said, I think it did change, because when I find the person that had come and searched before me, I then uncover this whole not secondary, but a whole other story about the man that Valerie ends up marrying, Hans. And Hans becomes, his name's Hans Fabisch, and Hans is an amazing character. He's this dashing, kind of upstart, and he creates this system for them where they take off the star. He puts it on hooks and eyes rather than sewing it to their coats so they can remove it and do things in neighborhoods where they're not known as Jewish. He creates this underground salon of, where older Jews could come and lecture to younger Jews so that they didn't feel so intellectually deprived. And he is daring and dashing, and, he becomes this kind of important character to me. And I hadn't really known as much of how to search for him. And then I became really, really interested. Valerie was, of course, my entry point. And that's in part because I think she was a woman, and in part because I think, this idea of my grandfather being a more complicated character, than we allow our grandparents to be. I think that just because they lived 75 years ago doesn't mean they couldn't have loved more than once and couldn't have been, people who loved more than one person. And, who was this woman that so captured him during his 20s? To me, that was really fascinating. And the fact that she obviously was super smart, and what did it mean to be a super smart university woman in Vienna in the 30s? To me, that whole idea became fascinating.
So growing up, did you have friends who had similar family stories to you, or was your family history and that Holocaust history isolating? Did you find it isolating?
I knew a fair number of people who had family who had been war refugees or survivors in some way, and a decent number of people whose family came out of Vienna. It wasn't isolating, I would say, although his experience was a bit different. All of them had a bit different experiences, so we knew a woman, for example, one of my mother's friends had a mother who had been the oldest on a kinder transport and sat at my parents' Shabbat table crying one night, within the last 15 years, telling us about the last time she saw her mother, and that her mother could have left her behind and didn't, and then got her a space on a kinder transport and then wasn't able to get herself out. So we did know these stories, and you would hear sort of whispered things about other people's grandparents who had been in Auschwitz, for example. So I think all of them had different case studies. I think in some ways my family was different insofar as my grandfather gets out 6 months after Anschluss, so there wasn't as much of a sense of what he'd gone through, because it was, he got out in the nick of time, and he got out with such, prescience and blah, blah, blah. And it was my friends in Vienna who said to me, that idea in and of itself isn't quite right. Those 6 months would have been brutal and horrible and life-altering. And so we'd always had the sense that of him being a refugee more than a survivor, and that kind of, that's of course true, but it was not as though he did not survive these very, very difficult months. Now, difficult months versus a death camp, there's no comparison. But at the same time, to me, it was interesting about what he might have had more in common with some of the families that I knew that had experienced much more brutality. No, I think that there was a consciousness around this idea of being European. And I think that sense was a little bit different. I had a sense of my family being European, an emphasis on knowing a lot of languages, for example, of always having a passport at the ready, just in case, you ever needed to flee or travel. My grandfather had my father have a passport from the minute he was born. So there's a tiny passport with my grandmother holding him up, and because he was always worried that they'd have to leave. And that was one of the things that I discovered at some point in the process of my adulthood, and included in the book, which was that I discovered he had bank accounts elsewhere in case he ever had to restart his life. And so it sort of challenged a little bit the sense of his sense of good fortune, and that everything was fine here, and that kind of thing.
Right, and whatever security he felt.
Right.
I have a question. You spend so much time in Vienna and writing about Vienna and kind of falling in love with Vienna. How do you feel about Vienna now that this whole process is kind of over? Has your relationship to the city, changed? Obviously it's deepened, but do you still have romantic feelings about the city?
I do, I think, yeah. I'm always Googling last minute airfares. Well, I had the incredible good fortune of being a fellow at an institute in Vienna, the Institute for Human Sciences, and I created a group of friends there that were really international, a handful of Austrians, Germans, a Norwegian woman, a Canadian woman, and I think that had I not had that really intimate friend experience, and it was sort of this hothouse of intellectual pursuit and debate, and I mean, they were all philosophers and historians and sociologists and one other journalist, and I think that that opportunity to have these conversations in a real way in this kind of hothouse summer camp sort of experience of it during that first spring changed everything for me. But I very much have a relationship to the city, even though it feels ghostly to me and strange. It feels a little bit more like I understand my grandfather's obsession with it in some way, and I love it similarly, though a bit differently. And no, I very much, it's a mix between loving the friends that I have there, and I have friends that I really feel very and colleagues or whatever that I feel very grateful for having the opportunity to know. I mean, because knowing real people in a city is a totally different experience from just visiting and sort of seeing buildings, and having access to what I think for me is actually one of the biggest takeaways of the book, and one of the things I want to push forward with going forward, which is, what does it mean to be third generation after a trauma? Not just victim, but also of bystanders and perpetrators, and not just of the Holocaust, of all these traumas that have kind of roiled the world over the last century. So is this something that we can think about going forward in other contexts? Is it something for Armenians to think about, or for Rwandans or Cambodians, or even I did a radio show here in DC on our local NPR affiliate where an African-American man called in and said his family had been part of the Great Migration, and the traumas of the Great Migration had kind of descended through his family, and there were sort of silences, and he's always been interested in pushing into it. I think actually this is really interesting, and in the Vienna context, it's for me the ways in which Jews and non-Jews carry this history into our generation, and what do we do with it? It goes back to the writer's question about, do our children need these stories, and how do we impart them without the trauma? You can't paper over them. You don't want it to be like these buildings where you go and you know that all these Jews live there, but no one knows anything anymore. But at the same time, you don't want to have nightmares. So, navigating that in an honest way has been a large part of my experience with Vienna. But I like the city very much. I like walking the city by myself and being in all these places and knowing what they loved about it, and then seeing it for myself and kind of grabbing pieces of it for myself has felt like a unique privilege.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. We just have a couple minutes left. This has been absolutely wonderful, and thank you again for joining us. I just want to ask you, as a final question, if you're working on another book and what's next for you, or if you're taking a little break.
Well, I've still been touring this book a fair amount and speaking about it and doing some just regular writing. And I am percolating on another book, although I'm not ready to talk about it. And yes, my hope is another book. Maybe this one won't take me 6-8 years or whatever. But yes, I'm thinking on another book, and writing and speaking all over. So come see me.
Yay! Well, we're excited to see what's next, and hopefully your next book can be in our book club next time. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.